Yes, may as well start it.
Okay, so today we have Jami Carlacio. She's completing her Master of Divinity at the Yale Divinity School. She's graduating in May. We're very excited. And she's on the ordination track at the Episcopal Church. So she plans to work in either student affairs or as a chaplain. And previously, she's taught writing and literature here at Yale in the undergrad writing program, and also at various colleges in New York, Wisconsin, and California. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters that deal with race and justice. And she has a forthcoming book from the University of Mississippi Press entitled Activism in the Name of God, Religion, and Black Feminist Public Intellectuals. She's also actively actively involved in racial justice efforts. So we're really lucky that she was willing to speak to the Yale grad school today about her experience. And so we're going to jump into her presentation in a minute. But we wanted to first just kind of acknowledge the day and the moment that we're living in and say that, there's kind of a lot of emotion attached with the verdict on the murder of George Floyd yesterday, and then following that, the murder of Ma'Khia Bryant. And so we just want to recognize that we're all kind of living through a sensitive time and doing our best, and that we're just going to be patient and respectful of each other today. So thank you so much for being here. And Jami, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Yeah, I also wanted to acknowledge, and maybe you know this, Chloe, how messy the work is. And sometimes we just have to sit in the mess and expect that it's going to be there, as opposed to, oh, how come this is so hard? Or I don't want to do it, or I feel really bad. So with that, I'll go ahead and start my screen sharing. All right, hold on here. We'll go here, top screen, slideshow. All right, so white allyship and anti-racism. And I subtitled the difference between a noun and a verb, because oftentimes we think of allies as nouns, but when it comes to racial justice and equity and justice in general, we have to really think of what an ally does as opposed to just what an ally is. So ally is not a noun. In social justice work, it's the person who uses their privilege to advocate on behalf of someone else who doesn't hold that same privilege. And actually, we can't really even do that until we are aware of the injustices. So until we are aware of it, we can't even really begin the work. But what we do have to do is take action and, change a thought, move a muscle. So actions can be, going to rallies, giving money to Black-owned businesses, speaking up when somebody says something and stuff. I'll go through some of that in a minute. I want to play this video for you. It's a wonderful, just a clip from a TED Talk, and she talks about allyship. Hold on.
Feel a strong connection to the Latinx community because I lived most of my childhood in Central America. This was a wonderful lifestyle, and one of my biggest takeaways was this sense of shared humanity. Shared humanity in the sense that diversity is beautiful and should be celebrated and embraced. Shared humanity in the sense that people do not have the same opportunities, and this social injustice exists on local and global scales. And shared humanity in the sense that we, as a society, have a responsibility to do something about that. My upbringing was critical to my decided, unwavering commitment to allyship, an active way of life that works to ensure equality, opportunity, and inclusion for everyone. We can all execute or exercise allyship in areas where we hold privilege: our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our religion, our education, our socioeconomic status, our health, our ableism. Allyship doesn't just mean constantly working on ourselves to ensure conscious and respectful behavior towards marginalized communities. It means committing to influencing our peers to doing that same self-examination. That family member who made that ignorant comment at possibly the Thanksgiving dinner table. That friend who made that insensitive joke at the party. That coworker who made that judgment call based on a stereotypical assumption. Allies are called on to be bridge builders who are willing to engage in difficult conversations with their peers who make up those same categories of privilege, to push through that discomfort for the sake of standing behind and next to marginalized communities and dismantling systemic oppression one person at a time, one mind at a time. Allyship isn't easy.
Right, that's a good ending point. So before we move on, I
feel a strong
on here. I wanted just to take a moment, Chloe, if you had any comments you wanted to share on that video or anything I've said so far.
I guess I'm just thinking about how like it is uncomfortable, and yeah, I think a lot of us have read white fragility or like, you know, heard the phrase kind of tossed around, and yeah, part of it is you know, staying with the uncomfortable feelings and not just, I don't know, like shying away and not talking about it, because that can, you know, do so much more harm than if we were to actually, you know, make mistakes and, you know, because it's like a lifelong learning process in the sense that allyship is not just like, oh, I went to a diversity summit, like check the box, I'm an ally now. So this kind of like over time and progression rather than a static objective to be achieved.
That's a really good point, saying that it's a lifelong journey and that it takes time and we have to keep doing it, because you're right, it's not just a box to check. It is important to do those kinds of things, go to those seminars, go to the trainings, and do as much as you can to inform yourself. But if that's all we do, then you're right, that's only part of the process. So just a couple things that Robin DiAngelo has said that really resonate with me. The most profound message of racial segregation may be the absence of people of color in our lives is no real loss. Not one person who loved me, guided me, or taught me ever conveyed that segregation deprived me of anything of value. And I could live my entire life without a friend or a loved one of color and not see that as a diminishment of my life. In fact, my life trajectory would almost certainly ensure that I had few, if any, people of color in my life. And I could have written that. I lived in a town where I wasn't exposed to people of color. I didn't live in a neighborhood where that was, my town was very segregated. But at the time when I was growing up there, I didn't understand segregation. And because it was just the norm, it wasn't ever talked about. There was never a question of, gee, why is it this way and not that way? So when you live, like I think of a fish in water, when you live in the water, you don't even know that you're in the water because the water is all around you and it's been there your whole life. And so this is just one image of how racial segregation worked, especially in the 50s. I know some people who are African-American who were living and part of this whole system where they had to go to schools, they had to be bused, they were never welcomed, they always felt like they stood out, and it was traumatic. It was actually a really traumatic time. And I also thought it was really interesting, the fact that, you know, the message we send to our children when we describe segregation as good. And even though they tried to desegregate the schools, it doesn't mean that it was a great experiment and that it didn't have any failures along the way. And then, of course, I'm sure you've heard this phrase from somebody, or maybe you even said it yourself, I'm not a racist, but, and so first of all, I don't think, and from my own trainings and experience, I have white skin privilege and I live in a racist society and I have benefited from structural racism. And I have said things unwittingly that were construed as racist or impacted people. And so I can't really say that I'm not a racist. And as soon as you say, but, that's going to invite a phrase that's going to try to absolve you of whatever sort of racism you think you don't possess. This is a real billboard in Arkansas, and it's a very good example of how a racist community would conceive of anti-racist work as anti-white because it's so threatening to their privilege. And again, it's very easy for some people. I won't generalize too much, but it's for some people who have privilege and don't recognize it, they may feel that they're oppressed because they're not being seen as having disadvantages. And certainly there are people with white skin privilege who are disadvantaged in other ways, but not recognizing the intersectionality of oppressions or recognizing where you can be oppressed in one category but not oppressed in another. And I am positive, because this has been all over the place, as soon as Black Lives Matter in 2012 with the Trayvon Martin verdict, as soon as that came out, Black Lives Matter was born. And as soon as Black Lives Matter was born, there was already pushback. All lives matter, blue lives matter. And I still see it today. And what's challenging is I posted something on my Facebook account when the violence against the Asian women happened. And I immediately got a response that all lives matter. And again, this person is well-meaning. So I don't even think she realized what she was saying, because it's so familiar that people often forget that it's not about that all lives don't matter. What it means is that we need to center those lives that have not mattered, and in some cases still don't matter. And microaggressions, obviously, they're everyday instances of racism, homophobia, sexism, and sometimes it's an insult or just a comment or a gesture. And again, they're called micro because they're not outright, out there aggressive kinds of racist statements. But I had a conversation with somebody who is extremely accomplished. She's a scholar, she's well known, she's the dean of a divinity school. She is a canon, which is of the National Cathedral. So she's extremely famous as a scholar. And I was interviewing her for something, and she was talking about, I said, stupidly, really, I said, do you still experience racism? And she laughed and she said, oh my God. She said, every single day I experience racism. And she said, and microaggressions, although they're not micro to me. And that made me think that the term microaggression probably was coined by a white person, not a person of color or a person who's on the receiving end of those aggressive actions and gestures. So now I want just to take a look at this bingo card and tell me which of the squares you've seen in practice or that resonate with you.
I think I've definitely seen things to the effect of playing the race card or always talking about race. And well, I mean, a lot of them, of course. Also, especially thinking recently, like the killer was just scared. That comes out a lot. Chloe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't care if you're black or white or green or purple. So the idea that you would diminish what it means to be a person of color by starting to name colors of the rainbow And Black people can be racist too, I've heard. I've never had racist thoughts. Slavery is over. I don't see color. I think a lot of people don't understand color blindness, and that when you don't see color, it's almost like you're erasing the person you're having a conversation with or that you're interacting with or that you know. My brother is, well, he's got a ton of privilege. He's a white male, white heterosexual male. And last year, after the riots started happening, after the George Floyd murder, and so he wanted to write a letter to the governor of New York, Cuomo, to support him in his own speaking out against it. And my brother wrote that he is colorblind. And so because he was open to it, I was able to write to him and say, actually, no, and this is what it means when you say that. And I was able to share something with him that helped him understand what it meant, what he said, and why that wasn't accurate, and what it was like coming from a white person saying that. And he was open to hearing that. And I think part of what we have to do is find ways to say stuff like that to people. And, you know, without, because if people feel threatened, they're not going to listen. They're just going to put up a wall. I was fortunate that he didn't put up a wall, and he ended up informing himself of Juneteenth and really starting to basically educate himself on racism, because he had never had to. He had never really been exposed to it. He'd always been on, you know, the shouting end of that, and it was unfortunate. All right, so here are some microaggression examples. I don't know if you've ever heard this. Where are you from? Where were you born? Especially like, where are you from? People often, you know, think, oh, well, you've got Black skin, you must be from the Caribbean or from Africa, when actually, no, I'm from Bedford, New York, or I'm from Tennessee. You know, I know somebody who is a Nigerian Muslim woman, and she's from Tennessee, but the first assumption that people might make is, oh, what country of Africa did you come from? And she has Nigerian roots, but she is an American. You know, she's Nigerian American Muslim. So anyway, those kinds of things, the assumptions, you know, we have the model minority, and that Asians are naturally intelligent. Assuming that it's unusual for a Black or Latino person to be in an academically rigorous program or prestigious university without like a special scholarship or something, or some kind of affirmative action. And that if they didn't have the affirmative action, you know, they wouldn't get in because they weren't qualified. And those assumptions, I think, still ring true. And one thing that gets me is, oh, whoops, I think that's the same one, sorry. When I look at you, I don't see color. America's a melting pot. I think that's an important one. It seemed like in the 70s and 80s, melting pot was a key phrase, like everyone used it. It was a great thing. Oh, okay, yeah, this is wonderful. Well, a melting pot diminishes difference, and it assumes everyone wants to be the dominant culture, and that differences aren't important anymore. And so the erasure of difference is also, you know, an act of racism, sexism. Sorry, my dog is with me. And so criminality, we all know that we, you know, driving while Black, breathing while Black. Patrisse Culler's book is a good example, When They Call You a Terrorist. And she talks about how her son was, her brother was criminalized. As a big Black man, he was mentally ill, and he got taken to jail, and he got roughed up by the police, and, you know, got pulled over. And as we know, Sandra Bland, you know, got pulled over and mistreated. And it seems like it doesn't seem to matter what, you know, a Black person does or a brown person does. they're automatically going to be assumed to be dangerous or armed. And as we know, that's usually not the case. It may be in rare instances, but recently we know that's not the case. And I have a friend who's Black. We've all probably heard that. And or I know what you go through. We can't really ever know what somebody else goes through unless we're in their skin. And even within non-dominant groups, there's a lot of diversity. So we can't sort of monolithically lump all Black people together or all women together or all Asians together and so forth. People who are anti-affirmative action would say the first thing, the smartest and most qualified student should get the job. And people who think affirmative action is just an unfair advantage without really considering that since the first Dutch ships imported Africans and kidnapped them and imported them to the US shores or the colonial shores at the time, have never had the same kinds of advantages. And so to assume that now that we live in this culture where everyone has equal opportunity, to assume that everyone has a level playing field is pretty much problematic. Can you think of any microaggressions that you've heard? Anyone?
I feel like the ones that you talked about are the most common ones that I hear as well.
Yeah, and there's a bootstraps one. Everyone can succeed if they just work hard. I was in a focus group not 2 weeks ago, and it was really important. It was kind of scary. There were several people of color, and three of us were white women, and we had three women of color and a white male Latino. And we were from different parts of Yale. Like I was from the Divinity School, somebody else was from the Jackson Institute, a couple people were from Yale College, undergrads, and somebody worked in student affairs. Two people worked in student affairs. They were actually doing the focus groups for the dean, Kim Goff-Cruz, as they're trying to figure out how Yale is doing and where Yale needs to really improve on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we were talking about whether people, especially people in non-dominant groups or marginalized groups, have opportunities to talk about what's going on or share the problems or have a space that's safe or, have access to resources. And the white male Latino said, I think everything is about economics. And if everyone, were economically equal, we wouldn't have any problems. And, if everyone just works hard, everyone would be fine. And I think all this racial stuff will just go away. And one of the people running the program was African-American woman. And then one of the younger people was an African-American woman, the other Yale College student. And they didn't say anything. And I found it to be a problem. So I spoke up and I said, I respectfully disagree with my colleagues. And I don't think that economic parity is necessarily going to solve the race problem, and that the racial issue is a very big part of what's going on in our culture right now. And so I think that we really need to be thinking about that. And I think if I hadn't spoken up, that comment would have just gone unchallenged. And it's another example of not really thinking about where your social location is and what other people's social location is.
Thanks for sharing
And
that example.
yeah, it was, I'm really glad I spoke up, because if I hadn't spoken up, I would have been complicit in that statement.
Yeah.
And here is, a Black professor is mistaken for a service worker. or, what do you do here? Versus, oh, you're a oh, what do you teach? The first assumption is not that they're the professor. And so cultural appropriation, I'll just move on to this really quickly. That is when non-dominant cultures, dress, hair, objects of devotion are appropriated by the dominant culture. And oftentimes without really thinking about where a ritual or a hairstyle comes from. And one example from the Native American community is smudging, for example. And smudging is a very important ritual in Native American culture, but it's become a really popular thing in Western culture. And you can buy, sage and bowls and special things. And it isn't to say you shouldn't do it, but it is to say you ought to know where it came from and why it is symbolic and why it is significant. So here's an example. It's natural to merge and blend cultures, but when we do things like this, which, as you know, happens all the time, and sports is a great example. Even my son's school, their mascot is the Indians, and there's a debate going on in the school district about changing the mascot, and there are actually more people who refuse to change the name of the mascot. So they're winning that debate. And I live in a town called North Haven, and it's largely white and mostly conservative. And there's a lot of privilege there. And I didn't move to that town because of that. I moved there not knowing any better. We moved there from New York City. And when I have a blended family. And so when we moved there, we were sort of like, oh my gosh, where did we move? And but our son's in school there, and he's a minority person. Actually, my son is brown. Here's another example. This received a lot of blowback, if you will, on social media. Kylie Jenner wearing a durag, not really understanding where they came from and how central it is to Black culture and how it actually refers back to, slavery. And it's kind of an affront. And here's another example, Gucci, so the fashion industry is, very guilty of cultural appropriation. And, this was just recently, really a couple of years ago. Did someone at Gucci ever bother to figure out what a dastar or turban means to Sikhs? Did it cross your minds to consider the history behind our identity? My people are discriminated against, even killed for wearing a turban. It just looks out of place, I think, to have somebody with really white skin wearing a turban, and, unless you really have converted to Sikhism. And I really like this tweet. If only America loved Black people like it loves Black culture. And then what allyship isn't, it isn't telling other people what to do, trying to solve their problems. That is not allyship. That is condescension, I think. And even those burdens that people carry, people don't understand. People who have inhabit places of privilege don't even understand what they are doing. And it's not about fixing other people. And certainly white people can't fix. White people can work against, the racial, the structural racism, and individually and maybe collectively, but we can't fix anything. We can listen, learn, and then of course try to understand. So the first steps are own that we are raced. And I first learned that white is a race in the 90s when I went to graduate school. So I went the first 30 years of my life inhabiting a white body and inhabiting a measure of privilege without really understanding that I inhabited privilege. and that gave me a lot of advantages. And it wasn't until I started doing work in critical race theory and working, within circles of social justice that I really understood that white was a race. It was a really big surprise. And, to be white in America is not to have to think about it. And that's very true. Nobody, worries about getting pulled over. Nobody worries about going in a store. Are people going to wonder if you're going to shoplift? It doesn't, you get pulled over. I just watched an interview a couple days ago, and between a white woman and a black man, and she was interviewing him, and the whole idea of the conversation was to allow him to share his experience and have a white person hear it. And he talked about getting pulled over, and he's actually an actor, and getting pulled over and being mistaken for somebody else. And so, like, the first thing they did is walk up to the car with their gun out, the cops. And he was so scared, he put his hands out the window to say, "I'm unarmed, what do you need?" And then she shared her experience of getting pulled over, and how she was mad, and the cop said, "Oh, just take a minute, it's okay, I'm going to go back to my car, I'll come back when you've collected yourself." So a completely opposite experience. But anyway, so recognizing our unearned privilege. Have you ever read Peggy McIntosh's The Invisible Backpack by any chance?
I've in a few of my class, I'm taking a class on race and sexuality in the American Southwest, and it gets cited a lot. And I know, yeah, talking about like unpacking all of the different individual privileges that white people have.
Yeah. I was in a workshop with Ruby Sales, civil rights activist, and I talked about white privilege, and she corrected me, and she basically vehemently corrected me. And I was in a Zoom meeting with a lot of people on the call, and she said, "Is it privileged that white people, kill Black people? Do you consider yourself privileged because you have advantages that other people don't have, and it's because of your white skin? And, do you consider yourself privileged because, your ancestors owned Black people?" And she kind of went on and on about all of the sort of really unsavory and bad aspects of what it means to be white in this culture are not privileges, because they're not things we should be proud of. So she really questions the concept of white privilege, which I thought was really interesting. I hadn't really obviously thought of it that way. And when Peggy McIntosh wrote that, she was certainly not thinking of it that way. But I think people like Ruby Sales, calling that out, I think is really important, and it really changed my thinking about it. Working collaboratively with people of color and nurturing truth-telling relationships. I was in an anti-racism training with the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Tennessee, and there were, it's a requirement if you're going into any work in the Episcopal Church, and it should be in other churches too, but I just know the Episcopal Church. And I didn't go into it for that reason. I went into it because I'm still trying to educate myself. And we were put into breakout groups, and they were random. And I kept getting put into groups with white people. And I don't need to learn from white people. I mean, sure, yes, I do, but I wanted to be in conversation with people of color. So I said something to the conveners. I said, "I keep getting put into groups with white people, and part of what I want to do here is have conversations with people of color." So next time I got put in a group with people of color, and then one of the people of color reached out to me after the workshop and said, "I would love to engage with you." And so she and I have formed a friendship, and we meet online and talk about what's going on. and some of the things she's involved in and things I'm involved in. And she happens to live in Florida, and I'm taking myself on a vacation when I graduate, and I'm going to go meet her and, spend time with her. But anyway, that's I think part of what we have to do. Work through shame and guilt. This is a hard one for me. Making a statement that has an impact on somebody and them saying something about it. My first instinct is to feel really horrible about it. And then on some level, I can't hear it because I'm feeling so bad about it. And I'm all thinking it's all about me and my feelings and my guilt. And that just stops me from being in a place of acceptance and learning. So it's hard to get out of that place, but I think we have to work to get out of that place. And as you said earlier on, Chloe, we have to stay with it. It is not something we're going to finish, but it is going to be bumpy. So some archetypes, I'll just be wrapping up here in a few minutes. The sponsor uses privilege and influence to vouch for or recommend a BIPOC in order to improve that person's good standing. So another thing, to do is in groups or not, just with other people, really amplify, or, well, there's an amplifier, but really help promote the work of other people. Talk about what skills and expertise you see, because it's very hard for people of color to speak up in situations where they're the minority. They may be the only Black person in the room, or one of the only Black people in the room, or they're not in a position of authority, so they're afraid to say something. So it's important to find ways to help them to achieve parity, or to at least be visible. And we may be in positions where we can do that in class or in groups, or, if you have a job or anywhere, we can do this. The champion is deferring to peers in underrepresented groups and sort of letting them take the lead in conversations. I've been in so many conversations in groups where the white male is the first to speak and takes up most of the time in the conversation and has no clue that he's doing that. And it's frustrating to watch. I have been in an anti-racist reading group at Wesleyan, and all of us are actually either faculty or staff at the university, and from all different areas of the university. And invariably, one of the first people or the first person to share is a white male, and he will dominate the discussion. And it's uncomfortable, and nobody interrupts him, or even the convener doesn't say anything. He's actually a Black gay man, and he doesn't intervene and say, oh, let's hear from other people or anything. So it's really challenging to be in places like that, but I think we have to do that. And one challenge that I see, at least at my son's school, is the curriculum is really lopsided. It's really white. It's really a whitewashed history. So I've asked the history teacher, what are you teaching? What's on your curriculum? What are you teaching? Oh, when they were doing the Revolutionary War, I said, are you teaching them about African Americans' involvement in the Revolutionary War? And she said, oh no, we're talking about the battles. And I said, African Americans fought in those battles. And I asked the same of the science teacher and the language arts teacher, just to really, put them, really kind of hold them to, what are you teaching our kids? And are all the students actually getting the whole story? And so it's, and then I actually have had conversations with people who say, Oh, yeah, they're gonna change the curriculum. It's like, why aren't they just doing it now? You know, why are you waiting a couple of years to figure out how to change the curriculum when a teacher can certainly include more books or include websites or have students do research? So the white privilege and the whitewashed history that we have is perpetuated on down the line right away from school. And so we have to disrupt it way down there. You know, even disrupting it for a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old, that's almost impossible. They're so ingrained. I mean, they're teachable. I make teachable people all the time, but it's much easier to do it when somebody's 6 years old. So here is an amplifier. One thing I have learned in my pastoral care classes and as a chaplain, I worked as a hospital chaplain last summer and then as a university chaplain, is learning how to listen to people and repeating what they say and not waiting to talk and making sure that, you know, affirming other people's comments, especially when they come from a non-dominant group. Even I feel dismissed in a class when I'll say something and then somebody else will say something and just move right along. And maybe something I said comes up in a comment later on by somebody else, and then that person gets amplified. So really thinking about how we can work to amplify voices like, oh, you know, that what Joanne said really resonated with me, and I want to go back to that point because I think it's really important, something like that. The advocate uses their own power and influence. So speaking up, holding accountable those who are excluding people, collaborating on projects, communicate, you know, creating community discussion circles, books and movie clubs. On campus here, I hired an African American student as my assistant because I wanted to be able to reach out to the minority community. It would have been just as easy to hire a white student to do the work, but I really deliberately asked the house managers of the minority themed houses, you know, who do you know, who can you send me, so that I would have a better chance of reaching other communities through a student who knows those communities. And I started a book group with these students, and we're reading 2 books written by Black women. And I think there are 2 white women besides me in the group, and everyone else is person of color. Not all of them African American, they're from different, you know, racial and ethnic categories, but it's a great way for us to have a conversation and have a space for that. And I think that's really important, you know, join a club, start a club, whatever you need to do. And then the upstander, this is the opposite of a bystander. You know, as far as I can tell, when we're silent in the face of microaggressions, macroaggressions, thoughtless statements, then we're just complicit. You know, we're part of the problem. And you know, social media can be tricky, using social media as a platform, especially when you're trying to get a job and, you know, you've got to have a professional profile. So, you know, using it diligently and with care and consideration. But I do think that since people are on social media, it is a strong platform. And Black Lives Matter started out as a hashtag, and it is now a worldwide movement. So social media can be really powerful. And the comforter, one thing I learned in some of my chaplaincy work is holding space for people and healing circles if necessary, just listening, um, seeing if somebody needs help. Hey, are you okay? Just wanted to know if you wanted to talk or you just want someone to sit with you. Just being available to people helps. Affirming the challenges, affirming the resilience, heart-centered expressions, And especially when they're sincere, I think people can kind of tell when you're sincere or not sincere. And I don't believe we have any people of color on the call. Am I correct? Hello?
That's right. Sorry, I forgot you can't see us. Yeah.
All right, I can't. Okay, so one of the challenges that I see is a lot of times people of color are expected to teach other people how to be or how to act, or they are the safe person or the liaison, or the people who have to expend the emotional labor to do stuff, when in fact that's not their job. It's our job, which is why I wanted to give this workshop, because I actually was trained in racial reconciliation by two women of color, and I was trained in trauma-informed yoga for serving underserved communities by a woman of color. But I thought it was important for a white person to talk about what a white ally is, because to me, it's not, I don't want to expect other people to do the labor that I should be doing myself. And I'm in a group called Recovery from White Conditioning as well. It's a 12-step group for people who are white and who are trying to be active anti-racists, but it's all about really owning our social location, owning our position, living in a racist society, and saying racist things, doing racist things, and how to act differently and be differently in the world. And one of the things that we say in our opening of every meeting is people of color have done our work for us for too long, and it's time for us to do our own work. And I just recently had a conversation with a clinical psychologist, and she's white. And one of the trainees, they're these people who are grad students, and they're going to become psychologists, and they work for a year under the direction of this person. And this person is actually the person I referred to earlier. She's a Nigerian ancestor. She's from Tennessee, but her parents are Nigerian, and she's a Muslim. And she was in a situation where a client, a patient in the group, was really acting aggressively and saying racist things and disrupting the group. And part of what a clinician's job is to remove the disruptive person from the group and ensure that the other group members feel safe. And at a conference presentation on race, on something about race and whatever dialectical behavioral therapy, the person the Muslim woman, I'll just call her Julie for sake, Julie expressed that she was told by the white clinician to go and do an intervention with this person, and she didn't feel safe doing it, and she didn't feel like she had the authority or ability to say no to her boss. And part of it was that she had to do a lot of emotional labor to do this basically anti-racist work, because there was some racist stuff involved. And the white person had no idea that it involves such emotional labor. So a lot of times we don't even realize how much labor is involved in doing this kind of work. And then just leave you with these parting thoughts. If you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So I'll stop it there.
Wow, that was really helpful and really informative. And I think what you said at the end of like, I just really appreciate how much time I know you put in this presentation for exactly what you were saying. Like, this is the work that white people need to be doing. And so I really appreciate like you living by that practice. Chloe, did you have any questions? I wrote a few questions down that I had throughout, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, I love the quote at the end. I'm in a feminist and queer ethnographies class this semester, and we talk a lot about oppression being linked. Like we read about, you know, specific instances of environmental harm or social injustice, all these things, and you can really kind of like look back and see how all of these things are interlinked, and you know